Human sheltered the lost alien girl during the storm. At dawn her guards declared him a criminal. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Ethan Miller was an ordinary man, living a quiet life in a small town tucked away in the rolling hills of the American Midwest. He worked as a mechanic at the local shop, spending most of his days fixing cars, chatting with regulars, and enjoying the peace that came with rural life. Ethan was known for his calm demeanor, his kind heart, and his willingness to help anyone in need. But everything changed one fateful evening when a storm unlike any other rolled in from the horizon. The weather had been strange that day, the sky turning an unnatural shade of purple, and the winds picking up, gusting through the trees like a warning. By the time the storm hit, it was already too late to seek shelter. Ethan was at the shop, working late on a broken-down truck when the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The storm was sudden and violent, with wind and rain lashing against the windows like the fury of nature itself. Ethan had no choice but to stay put until it passed. He knew the townsfolk would be safe at home, but something about the intensity of the storm felt different, dangerous, even. Then, as if summoned by the storm itself, Ethan heard a strange noise outside the shop. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but as the noise grew louder, he realized it was something, or someone, struggling against the tempest. Without thinking, he rushed outside into the pouring rain. The world around him was a blur of gray and black, the rain so thick it was almost impossible to see. But through the storm, he caught sight of a figure, hunched over and stumbling through the downpour. It was a girl. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her skin shimmered with an unnatural hue, a pale blue that almost glowed in the dim light of the storm. Her eyes were wide with fear, reflecting the chaos of the storm, and her clothes were torn, as though she'd been running for a long time. She looked exhausted, broken, and very much out of place. Without hesitation, Ethan ran toward her, shielding her with his coat as he guided her into the shelter of the shop. She was cold to the touch, trembling violently. "What happened to you?" Ethan asked, his voice steady, though his mind raced with questions. The girl looked up at him, her lips barely moving as she whispered, "I'm lost. Please, help me." Her words were almost too soft to hear, drowned out by the roar of the storm outside. Ethan didn't ask any more questions. His instinct was clear, he had to protect this girl, no matter the cost. As the night wore on and the storm continued to rage, Ethan did what he could to comfort her, offering food, water, and warmth. He was careful not to pry too much, though he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to her story than she was letting on. But for now, all that mattered was that she was safe. At least, for the moment. Ethan watched the storm rage outside, the wind howling like a wild beast, tearing through the trees and shaking the walls of the shop. Inside, the girl, Alia, as she had finally whispered her name, was huddled in a corner, wrapped in a blanket Ethan had found for her. Her eyes were wide, still full of fear, but there was something else behind them, a look of desperation, as if she was trying to hold something back, something important that she wasn't ready to share. Ethan didn't push. Instead, he moved quietly around the shop, trying to keep things calm. The storm outside was terrifying, but he could sense that Alia's presence was even more so. He could feel that she was different, that she didn't belong here in the way people did. As the hours passed, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Ethan was about to offer her some food when she suddenly spoke again. "They're coming," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan froze, turning toward her. "Who's coming?" he asked, though he already had a feeling he knew the answer. Alia's eyes darted toward the window, then back at him, her voice trembling. "My guards. They will find me. They won't stop until they do." Ethan's mind raced. Guards. What did she mean by that? He was about to ask more when the sound of distant engines reached his ears. His heart skipped a beat. They were close. Too close. Panic set in, but Ethan quickly pushed it aside. He had to stay calm for her. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his voice firm. Alia shook her head, her fear deepening. "It's too late," she whispered. "They can track me. No matter where I go, they'll find me." Ethan stood still, trying to think. He couldn't let them catch her, not if what she said was true. But the storm outside was only getting worse. He had to act quickly. "You can't stay here. It's too dangerous." He grabbed a flashlight and started to move toward the back door. "We'll have to go through the woods. It's the only way. They won't expect us to head in that direction." Alia hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her expression hardening. Ethan could see the resolve in her eyes. She was no longer just the frightened girl he had sheltered from the storm. She was someone else, someone capable of making tough decisions. Ethan didn't have time to question it. He threw open the door and stepped into the storm once again, this time with Alia beside him. The wind whipped against them, and the rain was so thick it felt like being slapped in the face. They moved quickly, making their way through the trees at the edge of the town, each step taking them deeper into the wilderness. Ethan could hear the engines growing louder now, the sound of pursuit unmistakable. They were closing in. The woods were their only hope. As they ran, Ethan glanced over at Alia, who was keeping pace beside him despite her exhaustion. She looked like she was holding something back, but Ethan didn't ask. Now was not the time for questions. They had to make it to safety. As the woods grew denser, the sounds of the storm began to fade, replaced by the eerie silence of the forest. The wind, the rain, it all seemed to disappear as they pressed on. But the danger was still there, lurking. In the shadows. Ethan didn't know who or what these guards were, but he knew one thing for sure, they wouldn't stop until they had Alia. And he couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. They had to find a way to outrun them, to disappear into the night. For Alia's sake. For his own. As they pushed forward, Ethan's mind was racing. What kind of people would chase down a girl like her? And what was she running from? What was the real story behind this mysterious girl from the storm? He didn't know the answers, but he was determined to find out. For now, all that mattered was keeping her safe, and finding a way to lose the people who were chasing them. The forest was their only chance. Ethan and Alia continued to move swiftly through the dense woods, their breath heavy, but their pace never faltering. The wind had shifted, no longer a torrential downpour, but a cold gust that cut through the trees like icy fingers. Ethan felt the chill gnawing at him, but it wasn't the cold that concerned him now. It was the sound, the unmistakable hum of engines getting closer, their metallic growl rising above the natural noise of the storm. The guards were still on their trail. The realization hit Ethan hard. There was no turning back now. He had made a decision, and there was no way to undo it. He had chosen to protect this girl, and he wasn't about to let anyone take her from him, not without a fight. "We need to find cover," he whispered, more to himself than to Alia, but she heard him. Alia didn't respond, but her eyes locked onto his, her expression a mix of fear and resolve. She knew the gravity of the situation just as much as he did. They needed to lose the guards before it was too late. Ethan scanned their surroundings. The forest was thick with trees, the underbrush dense, but there was no place to hide here. Not unless they could get deeper into the woods, beyond the reach of the pursuing vehicles. "This way," he muttered, grabbing her hand and pulling her through the thickening woods. They moved silently now, every step calculated, avoiding branches that might snap underfoot, staying low to the ground to avoid being spotted. It was strange. Despite the chaos and danger of the situation, Ethan found himself focusing on Alia. She was quick, almost too quick, darting through the trees with the precision of someone who knew how to survive in the wilderness. She wasn't just an innocent girl caught in a storm. There was something more to her. Something hidden. Ethan had begun to suspect it ever since she had first entered the shop. The way she looked at him with those strange eyes. The way she seemed to know exactly how to move, how to evade the storm and the dangers that came with it. And now, as they ran through the woods, her presence felt even more alien. She wasn't just running from the guards. She was running from something bigger. Ethan couldn't help but wonder, what was she running from? What had happened to her that made her so desperate to stay hidden? But there was no time to ask questions. Not yet. The forest began to thin out as they moved farther from the town, and Ethan's heart raced in his chest. The sound of the engines was still getting closer, and he could see the headlights now, faint beams cutting through the darkness. They had to hurry. Alia was beside him, her breathing steady, but he could tell she was struggling to keep up. "We can't stop," he said, urging her forward. "We need to get to the ridge. There's a cabin up ahead. We can hide there." Alia nodded, though she seemed less certain now. She had been quiet for most of their journey, but Ethan could sense the fear in her. It wasn't just the guards that scared her, it was something else. As they continued running, Ethan tried to push the fear from his mind, focusing instead on the path ahead. They reached the ridge just as the headlights of the vehicles broke through the trees. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. They were almost there. The cabin was in sight, a small, dilapidated structure that barely looked like it could withstand a heavy rain, let alone the kind of storm that had been tearing through the town. But it was shelter. And shelter was all they needed. "Almost there," Ethan urged, grabbing Alia's hand once more and pulling her toward the cabin. The sound of the engines grew louder, but they were so close now. Just a few more steps. And then, they would be safe. Ethan was certain of it. Or at least, he hoped he was. Ethan's heart pounded as they reached the cabin, the cold air biting at his skin. He could hear the vehicles now, their engines roaring just beyond the tree line, and he knew they didn't have much time. The cabin looked even older than he remembered, its rotting wood and broken windows barely visible through the thick trees. But it was their only hope. He pushed open the door, the creak of the hinges loud in the still night. Inside was dark, the faint smell of mildew filling the air. The place had clearly been abandoned for years. Ethan stepped inside, glancing around for anything that might offer them protection or shelter from the storm. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Get inside," he urged Alia, his voice low and urgent. She hesitated for a moment, looking over her shoulder toward the approaching lights in the distance. "We can't stay here," she whispered. "They'll find us." Ethan clenched his jaw, frustration welling up inside him. He didn't know what else to do, but he had to trust that they could make it through the night. "We'll be safe for now," he said, pulling her further inside the cabin. The door slammed shut behind them, and they were plunged into darkness. Ethan fumbled for a match, lighting it quickly and using it to spark the small, crumbling fireplace in the corner. The flames flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the room. The warmth was a relief, but it didn't calm Ethan's nerves. He knew they couldn't stay here long. He needed a plan. As he moved further into the room, Alia sat down in the corner, her back against the wall. She was silent again, her face drawn with exhaustion. Ethan noticed the way her hands shook, the way she clenched her fists in her lap as if she were holding something back. Something important. He approached her cautiously. "What's really going on, Alia?" he asked quietly, not wanting to break the fragile peace they had, but needing answers. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Fear? Pain? Both, maybe. "I'm not from here," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm from a place far away, a world you wouldn't believe. My people, my guards, they're not human. They're here for me. They won't stop until they have me." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected something wasn't right, but hearing her say it out loud was another thing entirely. He thought about the way she moved, how she seemed almost too quick, too precise in the forest. "What do they want with you?" he asked. Alia's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were filled with a quiet determination. "I was sent here on a mission," she said, her voice growing steadier. "But something went wrong. I was betrayed, and now they're hunting me. They think I have something they need, something that can change everything. But they don't understand. They don't know what they're really looking for." Ethan frowned, his mind racing with questions. "What is it you have?" he asked. "What do they want?" Alia shook her head, her expression pained. "I can't explain it all right now," she said, her voice growing more urgent. "But I can't let them find me. If they do, it won't just be me they take. It will be everyone. Everything." Ethan's stomach tightened at her words, the weight of the situation settling heavily on him. He hadn't signed up for any of this. He had only wanted to help a lost girl in a storm, but now he was tangled in something much bigger than he could have imagined. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Okay, he said finally. We'll figure this out. But we need to get to safety. We can't stay here. Not with them this close. Alia nodded, but there was something in her eyes, something dark and distant. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than she was letting on. And whatever it was bigger than just a girl running from her guards. He didn't know what was at stake, but he was beginning to realize that he was part of something much larger than he ever expected. And it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. But for now, the most important thing was keeping her safe. For both their sakes. Ethan sat against the cabin wall, his eyes scanning the shadows cast by the flickering firelight. Alia sat across from him, her face drawn, the weight of what she had shared hanging heavy between them. The night outside was eerily quiet, but Ethan knew it wouldn't last. The hum of engines had died down, but that didn't mean the danger was gone. He could feel it in his bones. We can't stay here much longer, Ethan said, breaking the silence. Alia didn't respond right away. Her gaze was distant, as if her mind was somewhere far beyond the walls of this old cabin. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. They will find us, eventually, she said. It's just a matter of time. But if we can keep moving, if we can stay ahead of them, she stopped, looking down at her hands. There's a chance. Ethan leaned forward, trying to understand. A chance at what? She looked up at him then, her eyes dark with something that wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something that had to do with the mysterious mission she had been sent on. A chance to stop them, she said, her voice almost a whisper. A chance to keep what I have from falling into the wrong hands. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What do you have, Alia? What is it that's so important? She shook her head, her eyes briefly clouded with frustration. I can't explain it fully, Ethan. It's not just a thing. It's part of me. It's my people's secret. They'll use it to destroy everything. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of her story. There was so much she wasn't saying, so much she was holding back. But he couldn't push her any further. Not now. He had to trust her, at least for the moment. The crackling of the fire was the only sound between them, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The air outside was still thick with tension, the kind that came before a storm. And he could feel it now, the weight of the choices he had made. Helping Alia had been the right thing to do, but every moment that passed brought them closer to the danger she had warned him about. Ethan didn't know exactly what her guards were, or why they were chasing her, but he knew one thing for sure, they wouldn't stop. And if they caught up to her, if they got their hands on whatever she was protecting, it wouldn't just be her life that was at risk. It would be everyone's. We need to leave, Ethan said, standing up abruptly. Alia's gaze followed him, but she didn't move. Where will we go? She asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan didn't have an answer. He didn't know where they could go. All he knew was that they couldn't stay here. We'll figure it out, he said, his tone more determined than he felt. We'll head for the mountains. There's a place up there, a cabin I know. It's far enough away that they won't expect us to be there. Alia looked at him, her expression unreadable. If we go, we won't be able to come back. Not until the danger has passed. Ethan nodded. He knew what she meant. Going up into the mountains was their best chance to escape, but it would also mean leaving everything behind. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision. But there was no turning back now. Let's go, he said, his voice resolute. They gathered what little they had, the fire still crackling in the background, and stepped out into the cold night air. Ethan could feel the chill in his bones, but it wasn't just the cold that made him shiver. It was the unknown. The danger that still loomed over them. And the feeling that, no matter how far they ran, they couldn't outrun the past. But they had no choice. The only way forward was through the mountains, and Ethan had no idea what awaited them at the end of that journey. All he knew was that they had to keep moving, keep ahead of whatever was hunting them. It was the only chance they had left. Ethan and Alia moved through the dense woods, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves and wet earth. The night was cold, the air crisp with the promise of an early frost. Ethan could feel the weight of the journey ahead, the uncertainty of it pressing down on him like a heavy stone. They had been walking for hours, the path winding through the trees, a seemingly endless stretch of wilderness. Alia had said little since they left the cabin. Her silence was heavy, but Ethan didn't press her. He knew better than to ask too many questions. For now, it was enough to just keep moving. The distant hum of the vehicles was still in the air, but it had faded into the background, swallowed up by the vastness of the forest. Ethan had hoped that they had managed to put enough distance between themselves and their pursuers, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. How much farther? Alia's voice broke through the stillness. Ethan glanced over at her, noticing how tired she looked. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but there was still a certain determination in her gaze. "We're close," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure. The path was unfamiliar, and the mountains loomed ahead like dark silhouettes against the starry sky. "We'll rest when we reach the ridge," he added, trying to reassure her, though the words felt hollow. They couldn't afford to rest for too long. The further they went, the harder it would be to escape, but they couldn't keep going without a break. Ethan's muscles were sore from the constant movement, and he could see Alia struggling to keep up. He wished he knew more about her, about what she was really running from, but now wasn't the time for answers. He had to keep her safe. That was all that mattered. The forest began to thin out as they approached the base of the mountain, the trees growing less dense and the ground beginning to slope upward. Ethan could feel the air growing thinner, colder, and he knew they were getting closer to the place he had in mind. There was a cabin near the ridge, a small, isolated structure that had been abandoned for years. It was perfect, far from the roads and deep enough into the mountains to be unreachable for anyone who might be looking for them. As they reached the base of the mountain, Ethan stopped for a moment, scanning the area. The forest was quiet now, the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures absent. It was too quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. "We need to move faster," he said, his voice low but firm. Alia nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes. She had heard it too. The silence. The way the world felt like it was holding its breath. "It's too quiet," she whispered, as if she were afraid to say it aloud. Ethan didn't respond. He just turned and started up the mountain, his feet crunching against the gravel and loose rocks. Alia followed him, her steps more hesitant now, but still determined. The climb was steep, the path narrow and winding, but Ethan kept his focus on the ridge ahead. They couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. As they neared the top, the trees began to thin out completely, leaving only rocky outcrops and sparse vegetation. The cabin was just ahead, barely visible against the backdrop of the darkening sky. Ethan's heart lifted slightly. They were almost there. But just as he reached the cabin, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a vehicle's engine. The hum was faint at first, but it was growing louder, closer. His pulse quickened. They hadn't escaped yet. They weren't safe. Ethan grabbed Alia's arm, pulling her into the shadows near the cabin. They crouched low, trying to make themselves invisible against the jagged rocks. The sound of the vehicle grew louder, closer. Ethan held his breath, listening to the engine as it passed by, but it didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. After a few moments, the sound of the engine faded into the distance. Ethan exhaled slowly, his body relaxing, but his mind was still racing. They had made it, for now. But he knew it wasn't over. They couldn't stay here long. The danger was still out there, lurking in the dark. And sooner or later, they would have to face it. Ethan crouched in the shadows, the cold stone of the mountain pressing against his back as he listened to the engine fade into the distance. The silence that followed was almost suffocating, broken only by the sound of his own breath and the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. He stayed perfectly still, not daring to move, not daring to make a sound. Alia was beside him, her eyes wide, her body tense, every muscle coiled with the same fear that gripped him. They had narrowly avoided being seen, but the danger was far from over. Ethan's mind raced. Whoever had been driving that vehicle might have been a scout, but there was no way to know for sure. It could be just a matter of time before others came looking for them. "We need to keep moving," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Alia nodded, but her expression was clouded with something else, something he couldn't quite place. She wasn't just afraid of being found, she was afraid of something else, something deeper. Ethan didn't ask. He had learned not to press her for answers. They had made it this far, and that was all that mattered. Do you think we're safe here? Alia's voice broke the silence. Ethan hesitated, looking at the cabin just ahead of them. It was small and rundown, its weathered walls barely holding together. He had hoped they could take shelter there for the night, but the more he looked at it, the less certain he felt. We'll have to risk it, he said, his voice steady. We can't keep moving through the mountains all night. Alia didn't argue. They moved cautiously toward the cabin, staying low, their footsteps almost silent on the rocky ground. The cabin was in worse shape than Ethan remembered. The roof had collapsed in some places, and the windows were shattered, but it was better than nothing. They slipped inside, the door creaking on its hinges as they pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dim and cold, the air musty with the scent of old wood and dampness. There was no furniture, no sign of anyone having lived there in years. But it was a place to rest, a place to catch their breath. Ethan closed the door behind them, bolting it as best as he could. He didn't know how much longer they could stay here, but it was better than being out in the open. We should get some sleep, he said, turning toward Alia. She had settled against the far wall, her face pale, her eyes distant. Are you okay? He asked, his voice soft. Alia didn't answer immediately. She stared at the broken window, her gaze unfocused. I'm fine, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't push it. He sat down across from her, keeping his eyes on the door, listening for any signs of movement outside. It was strange. In a way, he had hoped they would find some sense of safety here, but the cabin felt more like a trap. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone or something was waiting for them to let their guard down. The hours stretched on, the night growing colder as the fire bit in. The center of the room flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the walls. Ethan tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept drifting back to Alia and the things she had said, the things she hadn't said. What exactly was she protecting? Why were they chasing her so relentlessly? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound from the corner of the room. Alia shifted, drawing his attention. She was staring at something on the floor near her feet. What is it? Ethan asked, his voice low. Alia didn't answer at first, but her eyes were wide with alarm. She stood up quickly, her movements fast and fluid, as though the exhaustion had disappeared from her body. We're not alone, she said, her voice trembling. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stood up, his body on high alert. He didn't need to ask her what she meant. He could feel it too. Something was wrong. The silence had deepened, but it wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, as if the world around them was holding its breath. Alia stepped toward the door, her hand trembling as she placed it on the handle. Stay close, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. Whatever was out there, whatever was coming, they had to be ready. The night was far from over. Ethan's heart raced as he moved toward Alia, who was still standing by the door, her body tense and still. He could feel the air shift around them, the oppressive silence growing heavier by the second. There was something out there, something that had been lurking just beyond the reach of their senses, and now it was close. Alia slowly turned the door handle, her eyes scanning the darkness outside through the cracked window. Ethan moved up beside her, standing just a few steps behind. The last thing he wanted was to be caught off guard. They couldn't afford another mistake. What do you think it is? Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Alia's eyes remained fixed on the dark void outside. Her lips parted, but no words came out for a moment. It was as if she were weighing her next words carefully, as if she knew that saying too much could make it worse. I don't know, she said at last, her voice soft but filled with the same fear he had heard earlier. But I can feel it. It's not human. Ethan swallowed hard. He had always known that Alia wasn't from this world, but hearing her say it so plainly, with such certainty, made the truth hit even harder. They weren't just running from people, they were running from something far worse. Before Ethan could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the stillness. Soft, deliberate, but unmistakable. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was moving closer. Ethan's senses sharpened as he pressed himself into the shadows. His eyes flicked to Alia, who had gone completely still, her eyes wide and alert. He could see her chest rising and falling rapidly, her breath shallow. She was as afraid as he was, maybe more. Ethan's hand instinctively reached for the knife he kept hidden in his jacket, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever was out there, it was more than they could fight off with anything they had. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were coming from the direction of the woods, but they were coming at an angle, almost as if they had been circling the cabin, anticipating their every move. Ethan's stomach twisted with dread. Whoever it was, they had known exactly where to find them. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the air shifted again, colder this time. There was something unnatural about it, something that made every instinct in his body scream that they were no longer alone. He turned to Alia, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We need to move, now." Alia didn't hesitate. She gave him a sharp nod and moved toward the back of the cabin, her footsteps light but quick. Ethan followed, his heart pounding in his chest. They couldn't risk being caught here, not in this old, dilapidated cabin that offered no protection from whatever was stalking them. The back door was barely hanging on its hinges, but it opened with a soft creak, and they slipped out into the night, the cold air biting at their skin. They didn't stop to look back. They couldn't afford to. The sounds of footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left. Ethan's mind raced as they moved through the trees, their steps quick but calculated, avoiding the areas where the ground might give them away. The woods were dense, and the darkness was thick, but they had to keep moving. The mountain was their only hope, the only place they might find some kind of shelter. They had to get there. They couldn't stop, not now. Ethan glanced over at Alia, who was keeping pace beside him, her face grim and set. She hadn't said a word since they left the cabin, but her body language spoke volumes. She was scared. They both were. And yet, there was something else in her eyes now, something that had been missing before. Determination. As much as they were running from something, Alia was also running toward something, toward whatever mission she had been sent on. Ethan didn't know what it was, but he knew that it was the only thing that kept her moving forward. And that was enough for him. They didn't stop until they reached the base of the mountain. The air was thinner here, colder, and the ground was steeper. The trees thinned out, and Ethan could see the silhouette of the mountain ridge rising in the distance. But there was no sign of their pursuers. For now, they were safe. But he knew it wouldn't last. The night was far from over, and whatever had been watching them was still out there. They had only bought themselves a little time. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. They had to keep going. There was no other choice. But deep down, he knew something he hadn't admitted to himself yet: whatever was coming for them was not something they could outrun forever. Ethan and Alia moved swiftly up the mountain, the air growing thinner with each step they took. The cold was biting, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and made everything feel heavy. But they couldn't stop. Not now. Not with the danger still lurking behind them. The ridge was within sight, a dark outline against the sky, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every step, every breath felt like it echoed in the silence of the mountain. Alia kept pace beside him, her movements almost too quiet, too controlled for someone who had been running for so long. Ethan glanced at her, seeing the same determined look in her eyes that had been there ever since they first set off. She wasn't just running from something. She was running toward something, toward a mission, a purpose, something bigger than either of them could understand. Ethan didn't ask any more questions. He had learned that it was best not to push her for answers. The truth, whatever it was, would come when it was time. Right now, survival was all that mattered. They reached the base of the ridge, the steep incline ahead of them forcing them to slow down. The trees had thinned out, and the mountain's rocky surface loomed in front of them like a massive wall. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, though the cold air made it seem like he wasn't working hard enough to justify it. "We need to get to the top," he said, his voice steady, though his muscles ached from the climb. Alia nodded without speaking, her focus sharp. Together, they began the slow and difficult ascent, the rocks under their feet loose and unforgiving. Every step felt like a struggle against the mountain, but they couldn't afford to stop. They had come too far to turn back now. As they climbed, Ethan's mind kept racing. The events of the past few days played over and over in his head: the storm, the strange girl who wasn't human, the constant feeling of being hunted. He had never signed up for any of this. He had just wanted to help a stranger in need, and now he was deep in a world he didn't understand, running from forces beyond his control. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they reached the top. Would they finally be safe? Or was this just another place to hide, a temporary respite before the storm came again? His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp crack, a sound like a twig snapping in the distance. Ethan froze, his body tense. Alia did the same, her head turning toward the sound. The footsteps. They were back. This time, it wasn't just the faint echo of something in the distance. It was close. Too close. Alia's eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. Whoever or whatever was tracking them was getting closer. The air felt heavier now, the silence around them thick with the anticipation of something about to break. Ethan's heart raced as he glanced around, searching for cover, for something to block them from view. But there was nowhere to hide on the rocky path. The mountain was bare, offering no shelter. He pulled Alia close, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to move faster." She nodded, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. They couldn't afford to stop, not even for a second. With the threat growing nearer, every second felt like an eternity. Ethan pushed himself harder, his legs burning with exhaustion as they made their way up the mountain. His focus was razor-sharp, but in the back of his mind, the question loomed, what if they couldn't outrun this? What if they weren't fast enough? The thought lingered, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't think like that. Not now. The ridge was getting closer, the summit just beyond the next bend. But as they rounded the corner, the sound of the footsteps stopped. The mountain was silent again, and for a moment, Ethan thought they had lost whatever was following them. But as he looked up, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing at the top of the ridge, was a figure. A silhouette against the dimming sky, unmoving, watching them. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was impossible to make out details, but the outline of the figure was unmistakable. It was a person. Or something that looked like one. Alia stiffened beside him, her breath hitching. "They found us," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Ethan's mind raced, his pulse quickening. They had reached the top, but now they were trapped. And whoever was up there wasn't just waiting. They were ready. Ready for whatever was to come next.